Dr. Vincent Hayes closed his laptop and looked around the empty lecture hall. The last student had just walked out, backpack slung over their shoulder, probably heading to some late-night study session or maybe just back to their dorm. Vincent smiled slightly as he packed up his things. Teaching criminology at the State University wasn't just a job for him, it was his passion. Tonight's lecture had been about something close to his heart, bias in law enforcement. He'd spent 2 hours walking his students through real cases, statistics, and the psychology behind split-second decisions that officers make on the streets. Some students nodded along, others looked uncomfortable when he talked about racial profiling. Vincent understood that discomfort. These were hard truths to face. As he walked across the campus parking lot, Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from his wife, working late again? She'd written, followed by a laughing emoji. He quickly typed back, just heading to Corner Cafe to grade papers. Home by 10, the autumn air was crisp, and he pulled his jacket tighter as he reached his car. Vincent drove a simple Honda Accord, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. At 42, he'd learned that sometimes being invisible was safer. But tonight he wasn't thinking about safety. His mind was still on the lecture, on the questions his students had asked, on the research paper he needed to finish grading, the corner. Caf was his favorite spot for late-night work. They stayed open until midnight, the coffee was decent, and they had these comfortable corner booths where he could spread out papers without bothering anyone. It was about 15 minutes away, through one of the nicer neighborhoods in town. As Vincent drove through Maple Heights, he couldn't help but notice how different it felt from his own neighborhood. The streetlights were brighter here. The sidewalks were cleaner. Every house seemed to have a perfectly manicured lawn and a 2-car garage. He'd driven through here dozens of times before, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was because he'd just finished teaching about community policing and how neighborhoods like this one often got more attention from law enforcement. Not because they needed it more, but because the residents here had more political influence. It was one of those uncomfortable truths he discussed with his students. Vincent slowed down at a stop sign and checked his GPS. 2 more turns and he'd be at the cafe. He was looking forward to getting his grading done so he could spend the weekend with his family instead of buried in paperwork. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Jake Morrison was having what he would later describe as one of those nights. Nothing dramatic had happened, no high-speed chases, no dangerous calls. Just routine patrol work that left him feeling restless and irritated. His partner for the evening was Officer Lisa Park, a rookie who'd been on the force for less than 6 months. Morrison had been doing this job for 15 years. He'd seen it all, or at least he thought he had. Drug dealers, gang members, domestic violence calls that went south fast. He'd handled them all. And in his experience, you developed instincts about people. You learned to read situations quickly because hesitation could get you killed. Tonight, though, Morrison was dealing with more than just job stress. His marriage was falling apart, his teenage son barely spoke to him anymore, and his supervisor had been on his case about some complaints from the community. Nothing serious, just people saying he was too aggressive during traffic stops. Morrison figured it was just the usual anti-police sentiment that seemed to be everywhere these days. "Control, Unit 247, Morrison spoke into his radio as they cruised through the Maple Heights area. "All quiet on Sector 7, Lisa looked over at her partner. She'd heard stories about Morrison from other officers. Some said he was a good cop who got results. Others whispered that he was a throwback to an older style of policing that maybe didn't fit with modern times. Lisa was still figuring out where she stood on that. "Hey, Morrison," she said, trying to make conversation. "What made you want to?" "Become a cop?" Morrison glanced at her and shrugged. "Family business, I guess. My dad was a cop, my grandfather too. Back then, people respected the badge. Now everyone thinks we're the enemy." Lisa nodded but didn't respond. She joined the force because she wanted to help people, to make a difference in her community. She wondered if Morrison had felt that way once too, or if something had changed along the way. As they turned onto Elm Street, Morrison's attention was caught by a Honda Accord driving slowly through the neighborhood. The car wasn't speeding, wasn't weaving, wasn't doing anything obviously wrong, but something about it bothered Morrison. "Look at that," he said to Lisa, nodding toward Vincent's car. "What do you think he's doing here?" Lisa looked at the car and then back at Morrison. "Driving?" She said, not sure what she was supposed to be seeing. "Come on, Park. Use your eyes. Look around this neighborhood, then look at that car." Lisa looked. Again, she saw a modest sedan driving carefully through an upscale neighborhood. The driver was following all traffic laws, signaling properly at turns, maintaining a safe speed. She didn't see anything suspicious. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said honestly. Morrison sighed like he was dealing with a particularly slow student. "Guy like that doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this unless he's up to something. Probably looking for customers." "Customers?" Lisa asked. "Drug customers. These rich neighborhoods, they've got plenty of money to spend on whatever he's selling. Classic setup, dealer cruises through, makes his deliveries, gets out before anyone notices." Lisa felt uncomfortable. She looked at the car again, trying to see what Morrison was seeing. The driver seemed to be following GPS directions, occasionally glancing at his phone. He didn't look like he was scouting for anything. "Maybe he's just lost," she suggested. Morrison snorted. "Yeah, right. Trust me, after 15 years, you develop a sense for these things. That guy is dirty." Vincent, completely unaware that he was being watched, made another turn according to his GPS, almost there. He was thinking about the stack of midterm exams in his bag and wondering if he'd remembered to bring enough red pens. His students would probably be shocked to learn that he actually enjoyed reading their papers. Even the ones that needed a lot of work. At a red light, Vincent checked his phone. Again. A message from one of his graduate students asking about a research project they were working on together. Vincent quickly typed back that they could discuss it during office hours tomorrow. The light turned green, and Vincent continued toward the cafe. He had no idea that 2 police officers were now following him, or that one of them had already decided he was a criminal. Morrison reached for his radio. "Control, Unit 247. I've got a suspicious vehicle in Sector 7, requesting permission." To conduct a traffic stop, Lisa looked at him in surprise. "What's the violation?" Morrison thought for a moment. "Broken taillight," he said. Even though he couldn't actually see the back of Vincent's car clearly from their position, the radio crackled back. "Unit 247. Proceed with caution." Morrison hit the lights and siren, and Vincent's peaceful evening was about to become something very different. Vincent saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. He'd been driving carefully, following all the traffic laws, so he couldn't imagine what he'd done wrong. But he knew the drill. His own father had taught him years ago, and he'd passed the same lessons on to his students. Pull over safely, keep your hands visible, stay calm, and be respectful. He found a well-lit spot near a small shopping center and pulled over, making sure to use his turn signal. Vincent turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. His heart was beating faster than usual, but he reminded himself that this was probably just routine. Morrison stepped out of the patrol car, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. Lisa followed, though she stayed back by their vehicle. Something about this whole situation still didn't feel right to her. But Morrison was her training officer, and she was supposed to learn from him. "Good evening, sir," Morrison said as he approached Vincent's window. His tone was professional but cold. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Vincent kept his hands on the wheel and looked up at the officer. "No, sir, I don't." "I thought I was following all the traffic laws." Morrison studied Vincent's face for a moment. Up close, he looked educated, well-dressed, not like the typical street dealer Morrison usually dealt with. But that didn't change. His suspicion, if anything, it made him more convinced. The smart ones always looked innocent. "Your left taillight is out," Morrison said, though he hadn't actually checked to see if this was true. "That's a safety violation." Vincent was confused. He'd just had his car inspected 2 weeks ago, and everything had been fine. But he wasn't about to argue with a police officer on the side of the road. "I'm sorry, officer, I wasn't aware of that. I'll get it fixed first thing tomorrow." Morrison nodded slowly. License and registration, please. Vincent carefully reached for his glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately. I'm reaching for my registration now, he said, narrating his movements the way he taught his students. To do, he pulled out the documents and then reached for his wallet. Here you go, sir, Vincent said. Handing over his driver's license and registration, Morrison took the documents and studied them carefully. Dr. Vincent Hayes, age 42, address in a middle-class neighborhood across town. Clean driving record. No warrants. Everything looked legitimate, but Morrison wasn't satisfied. What brings you to this neighborhood tonight, Dr. Hayes? Morrison asked, emphasizing the title with a slight edge in his voice. I'm heading to Corner Cafe to do some work, Vincent replied honestly. I'm a professor at the university, and I have papers to grade. Morrison looked back at the Honda, then at Vincent. Kind of late to be going to a coffee shop, isn't it? They're open until midnight. I often go there when I need a quiet place to work. And you chose to drive through this particular neighborhood to get there? Vincent was starting to feel uneasy. The officer's questions seemed to have an underlying suspicion that he couldn't understand. My GPS directed me this way. It's the most direct route. Morrison walked back to his patrol car, leaving Vincent sitting there wondering what was happening. Lisa stepped closer to her partner as he ran Vincent's information through the system. Everything coming back clean? She asked. Yeah, no priors, no warrants, Morrison said, but he didn't sound pleased about it. But that doesn't mean anything. The smart ones know how to stay off the radar. Lisa looked back at Vincent, who was still sitting patiently with his hands on the steering wheel. He seems pretty cooperative. Maybe we should just give him a warning about the taillight and let him go. Morrison shot her a look. Park, you've been on the job for 5 months. I've been doing this for 15 years. You learn to trust your instincts, and my instincts are telling me this guy is dirty. But what evidence do we have? Sometimes you don't need evidence right away, you develop it. Morrison closed the laptop and walked back to Vincent's car. Vincent had been sitting there for about 10 minutes now, watching other cars drive by. A few people had slowed down to look at the traffic stop, and he felt embarrassed even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He thought about his wife at home, probably wondering why he was taking so long to get to the cafe. Dr. Hayes, Morrison said as he approached the window again, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Vincent felt a chill run through him. May I ask why, officer? I'd like to conduct a brief search of your vehicle. A search? Vincent tried to keep his voice calm. What's the reason for the search? Morrison's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who was probably a criminal trying to hide behind a fancy title and polite words. I don't need to explain myself to you, Morrison said. Step out of the car, now. Vincent knew his rights. He taught constitutional law as part of his criminology courses. But he also knew that arguing with a police officer on the side of the road could escalate a situation quickly. Still, he felt compelled to at least try to understand what was happening. Officer, I don't consent to a search. I haven't committed any crime, and I don't believe you have probable cause. Morrison's face flushed with anger. Are you a lawyer? Now, doctor, I teach criminal justice at the university. I'm familiar with Fourth Amendment protections. Well, let me educate you about something, Morrison said, leaning closer to the window. I smell marijuana coming from your vehicle? That gives me probable cause to search? Vincent was stunned. There's no marijuana in my car, officer. I don't use drugs. That's what they all say. Step out of the vehicle. Lisa watched this exchange. From a few feet away, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. She couldn't smell any marijuana, as she'd been standing right there the whole time. The professor seemed genuinely confused and concerned. Not like someone trying to hide something illegal. Vincent slowly got out of his car, his mind racing. He thought about all the lectures he'd given about police encounters, all the advice he'd given his students about staying calm and complying with lawful orders. But was this a lawful order? He wasn't sure anymore. Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car, Morrison instructed. Vincent complied, feeling the cool metal against his palms. He stared at the cafe across the street, where he'd planned to spend a quiet evening grading papers. Other customers were visible through the windows, sipping coffee and working on laptops. Completely unaware of what was happening just a few hundred yards away, Morrison began searching the car. Starting with the front seats, he moved Vincent's laptop bag and coffee cup, looking under the seats and in the door compartments. Lisa stood nearby, unsure whether she should be helping or questioning what was happening. "What exactly are you looking for?" Vincent asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You know what I'm looking for?" Morrison replied without looking up from his search. "I really don't, officer. I'm just a college professor trying to get to a coffee shop." Morrison paused and looked at Vincent. "You keep saying that like it means something. You think being a professor makes you special? You think it means you can't be dealing drugs?" Vincent was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about a broken taillight or suspected marijuana. This was about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with anything he'd actually done wrong. The realization was both frightening and sadly familiar. He'd studied this phenomenon, taught about it, written papers about it, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. Morrison continued his search of the front seat area, becoming more frustrated with each passing minute. He'd been so certain he would find something: drugs, paraphernalia, large amounts of cash, anything that would validate his suspicions. But so far, all he'd found were the ordinary belongings of what appeared to be exactly what Vincent claimed to be. A college professor, there was a travel coffee mug with the university logo on it, a parking pass for the faculty lot hanging from the rearview mirror, some loose change in the cup holder, and a pack of sugar-free gum. Nothing even remotely suspicious, but Morrison wasn't ready to give up. In his mind, the absence of obvious evidence just meant Vincent was smarter than the average dealer. The good ones knew how to hide their operation in plain sight. "Officer Morrison," Lisa said quietly, stepping closer to her partner. "Maybe we should—" "Not now, Park," Morrison cut her off without looking up. He was opening the glove compartment, pulling out the owner's manual, insurance papers, and a small emergency flashlight. Still nothing. Vincent watched the search from his position against the car, his hands still pressed against the roof. He felt violated and angry, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting emotional now would only make things worse. He thought about his students, about the young black men and women in his classes who had shared their own stories of traffic stops that had gone wrong. Now he understood their fear in a way he never had before. "This is a legal search and seizure," Vincent said carefully. "I've stated clearly that I don't consent to this search and you don't have probable cause." Morrison stood up from the car and faced Vincent directly. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "I'm telling you about the Constitution." "The Constitution?" Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about the Constitution? How about you tell me what you're really doing in this neighborhood?" "I've already told you. I'm going to Corner Cafe to grade papers. Right, the professor story. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know how this works?" Morrison walked around to the back of the car. "Dealers like you use whatever cover. Story sounds good, teacher, businessman, whatever. But I've seen it all before." Vincent felt a surge of anger but pushed it down. "Dealers like me? What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" Morrison paused, realizing he'd revealed more of his thinking than he intended. He couldn't exactly say what he meant without crossing lines that even he knew were problematic. Instead, he focused on the trunk. "Open it," he ordered, though Vincent hesitated. He had every right to refuse, but he also knew that refusing might escalate the situation even further. And frankly, he had nothing to hide. Maybe if Morrison searched the trunk and found nothing, this whole nightmare would finally end. "The trunk. Release is inside the car," Vincent said. Morrison reached through the driver's side window and popped the trunk. Inside, he found exactly what you'd expect to find in a professor's car: a box of books, some academic journals, a spare tire, jumper cables, and an emergency kit. There was also a briefcase that caught Morrison's attention. "What's in the briefcase?" Morrison demanded. "Lecture notes, research papers, student assignments. It's for my job." Morrison pulled the briefcase out and set it on the ground. It was locked with a simple combination lock. Open it. Vincent sighed and walked over to the briefcase. As he knelt down to work the combination, he noticed a small crowd starting to gather. People were coming out of the nearby shops and restaurants, drawn by the flashing police lights. Some were taking pictures with their phones. The briefcase clicked open, and Morrison immediately began rifling through its contents. There were indeed lecture notes, typed and handwritten, academic papers with titles like Community Policing Strategies and Reducing Bias in Law Enforcement. Student. Papers with grades and comments written in red ink. Morrison picked up one of Vincent's research papers and scanned it. It was about racial profiling in traffic stops, with statistical analysis and policy recommendations. Morrison's face grew red as he read. "What is this garbage?" Morrison said, holding up the paper. "It's my research. I study law enforcement practices." "You study us?" Morrison's voice was rising. "You sit in your ivory tower and write papers about how cops are all racists?" Vincent could see this was heading in a dangerous direction. "My research is objective and data-driven. I work with police departments to improve community relations." "Improve community relations," Morrison repeated mockingly. "So you're one of those anti-police activists hiding behind academic credentials." Lisa had heard enough. She stepped forward, her voice firm but respectful. "Morrison, I think we need to wrap this up." "There's nothing here." Morrison spun around to face his partner. "Nothing? Are you kidding me? This guy is writing hit pieces about police officers, probably teaching students to hate cops, and you think there's nothing here?" "Being a professor isn't a crime," Lisa said simply. "Maybe not, but dealing drugs is." Morrison turned back to Vincent's car with renewed determination. He'd found academic papers critical of police work, which in his mind confirmed everything he'd suspected about Vincent. Morrison began searching more aggressively, pulling out floor mats, checking under seats more thoroughly, and examining every inch of the interior. He was looking for hidden compartments, secret spaces where drugs might be concealed. Vincent watched this increasingly frantic search with a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. Morrison was clearly becoming more agitated, not less, as he failed to find any evidence of wrongdoing. "Officer, how much longer is this going to take?" Vincent asked. "I have work to do, and I'd like to know what specific crime you suspect me of committing." "Drug trafficking," Morrison said without hesitation. "Based on what evidence?" "Based on 15 years of experience." Vincent shook his head. "That's not evidence. That's prejudice." The word hung in the air between them. Morrison stopped searching and slowly turned to face Vincent. The accusation of prejudice hit closer to home than Morrison wanted to admit, and it made him even angrier. "Prejudice?" Morrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You think this is about prejudice?" "I think this is about you seeing a black man in a nice neighborhood and assuming he doesn't belong there," Vincent said, finally giving voice to what they both knew this was really about. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Several people were openly recording the interaction with their phones. Lisa noticed the crowd and felt increasingly uncomfortable with how this was playing out in public. Morrison was aware of the crowd too, but instead of making him more careful, it made him feel defensive and exposed. He'd gone too far to back down now. He had to find something to justify this stop, or he'd look like exactly what Vincent was suggesting he was. "You want to make this about race?" Morrison said. "Fine, but I've stopped plenty of white drug dealers too. This isn't about what you look like. It's about what you're doing." "And what exactly am I doing?" "You're driving through a neighborhood where you don't belong at a time when dealers make their rounds with a car full of anti-police propaganda." Vincent couldn't believe what he was hearing. Anti-police propaganda? "Those are peer-reviewed academic papers. Same thing." Lisa had reached her breaking point. "Morrison, we need to call this in. Let the sergeant decide how to proceed." Morrison didn't want supervisor involvement. He knew that once his sergeant arrived and reviewed the situation, there would be questions about the validity of the stop. But he was trapped now. He'd committed too far to this course of action. "Fine," Morrison said. "Call it in. But I'm finishing my search first." He returned to Vincent's car with even more determination, now searching areas he'd already checked. The laptop bag in the back seat caught his attention again. Earlier, he'd looked inside and found only a laptop, charger, and some papers. But now he examined it more carefully. The bag was well worn but expensive looking. Too expensive for what a college professor should be able to afford, Morrison thought. This had to be the evidence he'd been looking for. Drug money had to be paying for this lifestyle. Lisa pulled out her radio with shaking hands. She'd never had to call for supervisor backup before, and she wasn't sure exactly what to say. But she knew this situation was spiraling out of control, and someone with more authority needed to step in. Control, this is Unit 247. We need a supervisor at our location for a traffic stop consultation. The radio crackled back. Unit 247, nature of the consultation? Lisa looked at Morrison, who was still aggressively searching Vincent's laptop bag for the second time. She chose her words carefully. We have a complex situation that requires supervisor guidance. Copy that, Unit 247. Sergeant Rodriguez is en route, ETA 5 minutes. Morrison looked up sharply when he heard the radio exchange. His face was flushed with anger and frustration. I didn't authorize you to call for backup. You said to call it in, Lisa reminded him. I meant call in the stop, not call for a supervisor. Morrison. Look around. We've got people recording us. We've been here for 30 minutes and we haven't found anything. We need help. Morrison glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers. There were at least 15 people now, most of them holding phones. He could see the red recording lights blinking. This was exactly the kind of situation that ended up on social media and made the evening news. Vincent remained by his car, watching this exchange between the two officers. He could sense the tension between them, and it gave him a small glimmer of hope that maybe Lisa would be able to talk some sense into her partner. Officer, Vincent said to Lisa, I'd like to request that I be allowed to call my attorney. Morrison spun around. Your attorney? Why do you need an attorney if you're innocent? Because this is America, and that's my constitutional right. Guilty. People call attorneys, Morrison said. Innocent people cooperate. Vincent stared at Morrison in disbelief. I've been cooperating for 30 minutes. I've answered your questions. I've allowed you to search my car even though I don't consent to it, and I've remained calm and respectful throughout this entire encounter. You've been arguing with me about the Constitution because you're violating it. The crowd was getting closer now, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Vincent could hear people talking among themselves, speculating about what was happening. Some seemed to think he must have done something wrong. Why else would the police be searching his car? Others seemed suspicious of the officer's behavior. That's a nice car for a teacher, called out someone from the crowd. Morrison's head snapped toward the voice. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit was standing at the edge of the group, arms crossed. Morrison couldn't tell if the man was supporting him or criticizing him. Sir, please step back, Lisa said to the man. This is an active police investigation. Investigation of what? The man asked. I've been watching for 10 minutes, and it looks like harassment to me. Morrison felt his face getting redder. Now random citizens were questioning his authority. This was exactly what was wrong with society these days. No respect for law enforcement. Everyone needs to move back and mind their own business, Morrison shouted to the crowd, but his outburst had the opposite effect. More people started coming out of the nearby shops and restaurants, curious about the commotion. Vincent noticed that the crowd was mixed, some black, some white, some Hispanic. He wondered how many of them had experienced something similar. Morrison returned his attention to Vincent's laptop bag, pulling out papers and examining them one by one. Student essays, research notes, printouts of academic articles. Everything looked legitimate, but Morrison was convinced he was missing something. Then, he found Vincent's wallet. It had fallen out of the bag during his search, and Morrison picked it up with renewed interest. Maybe this was where he'd find what he was looking for. Drug dealers always carried large amounts of cash, fake IDs, burner phone numbers. "I'd like to search your wallet," Morrison announced. Vincent felt a chill run through him. "That requires a warrant." "No, it doesn't. You're detained as part of a drug investigation." Vincent knew Morrison was wrong about the law, but he also knew that arguing further might escalate things even more. And besides, there was nothing incriminating in his wallet. Just the usual stuff: credit cards, driver's license, family photos, some cash. Vincent's stomach dropped as he remembered what else was in his wallet. He'd been carrying it for so long that he'd almost forgotten about it. But Morrison was about to find something that would change everything. "Go ahead," Vincent said quietly. He didn't have a choice. Morrison opened the wallet eagerly, expecting to find evidence of drug dealing or at least something suspicious. Instead, he found what looked like the wallet of a regular law-abiding citizen. Credit cards from major banks, a Costco membership card, a library card, photos of what appeared to be Vincent's family, a woman and two teenagers all smiling at the camera. Some business cards from other professors and university administrators. Morrison's frustration was reaching a boiling point. He'd been so certain about Vincent, so sure that his instincts were right. But every piece of evidence pointed to exactly what Vincent claimed to be: a college professor going to a coffee shop to grade papers. $43 in cash, Morrison said, counting the bills. "That's not very much for a drug dealer." "Because I'm not a drug dealer," Vincent said patiently. The crowd was getting restless. Someone called out, "How long does it take to write a ticket for a broken taillight?" Another voice added, "This is ridiculous. Let the man go." Lisa was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. She'd joined the police force to serve and protect her community, not to harass innocent people. But Morrison was her training officer, and she was supposed to learn from him. "Morrison," she said quietly, "maybe we should issue a warning for the taillight and let him go." "Sergeant Rodriguez will be here any minute." Morrison ignored her. He was looking through the rest of Vincent's wallet now, examining every card, every piece of paper. There had to be something. A business card from a known drug dealer, a note with suspicious phone numbers, anything. He found Vincent's university ID card, which matched his driver's license. A health insurance card, auto insurance, a voter registration card. Everything was legitimate and normal. Then Morrison found something that made him pause. It was another ID card, but it looked different from the university ID, more official. Somehow, government-issued. Morrison pulled it out and looked at it more closely. It was partially hidden behind Vincent's driver's license, which is why he hadn't noticed it before. Vincent watched Morrison examine the card, and his heart started beating faster. This was the moment everything was going to change. After 30 minutes of accusations and illegal searches, Morrison was about to discover something that would turn this entire encounter upside down. "What's this?" Morrison asked, holding up the card but not looking at it closely yet. Vincent took a deep breath. "Perhaps you should read it." Morrison looked down at the card in his hand, and his expression began to change as he processed what he was seeing. The color drained from his face, and his hand started to shake slightly. The crowd sensed that something significant was happening. The chatter died down as people strained to see what the officer had found. Lisa stepped closer, trying to get a look at whatever Morrison was holding. She could see that his entire demeanor had shifted from aggressive confidence to something that looked almost like fear. "Morrison," she said, "what is it?" But Morrison couldn't speak. He just stared at the card in his hand, realizing that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Morrison stared at the badge in his hand like it was a live snake. The words Drug Enforcement Administration and Special Agent seemed to burn into his vision. Below that was Vincent's photo and his full name, Dr. Vincent Hayes, D. Consultant. The badge was real. Morrison had seen enough federal credentials in his career to know authentic ones when he saw them. The holographic security features, the official seal, the government-issued identification number. Everything about it screamed legitimate federal authority. Morrison's mouth went completely dry. His hands were shaking now, and not just slightly. The badge felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "This has got to be fake," Morrison stammered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He'd spent the last 30 minutes accusing a federal agent of being a drug dealer. Vincent remained calm, though inside he felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. "It's real, Officer Morrison. I'm a consulting agent with the DEA. I work with law enforcement agencies to develop training programs and policy recommendations." Lisa stepped closer and looked at the badge over Morrison's shoulder. Her eyes went wide as she read the credentials. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, oh no." The crowd had sensed that something major was happening. People were stretching to see what the officers had found, and several phones were still recording everything. Morrison looked up at Vincent, then back down at the badge, then up at Vincent again. His brain was struggling to process this information. For 30 minutes, he'd been absolutely certain that Vincent was a criminal. He'd staked his reputation, his career, his entire sense of professional judgment on that belief. "Why didn't you tell me?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vincent's response was measured and thoughtful. "Because I shouldn't have to flash a federal badge to be treated with basic respect and dignity. Every citizen has the right to drive through a neighborhood without being harassed by police. But you're law enforcement?" "Yes, I am. But that's not the point. The point is that you pulled me over without cause, searched my vehicle without consent or probable cause, and spent 30 minutes trying to prove I was a criminal based on nothing more than your assumptions." Morrison felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about this situation had just been turned upside down. The drug dealer he'd been so certain about was actually a federal agent who worked to catch real drug dealers. Lisa was looking around nervously. She could see Sergeant Rodriguez's patrol car turning into the parking lot, lights flashing. In about 30 seconds, their supervisor was going to arrive and want to know why they'd been detaining a DEA agent for half an hour. "Vincent," Morrison said, using his first name for the first time. "Listen, maybe we can work this out. You know how it is out here. We have to make quick decisions. Sometimes we make mistakes." Vincent looked at Morrison with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "Officer Morrison, I do know how it is out here. I've spent years studying police work, training officers, and working alongside law enforcement. But what happened here tonight wasn't a mistake, it was bias. It wasn't about ... double quotes Morrison started to say, then stopped. He couldn't finish that sentence because they both knew it wasn't true. "It wasn't about what?" Vincent asked gently. "About race? About me being a black man driving through a white neighborhood? About your assumptions regarding who belongs where?" Morrison couldn't answer. The truth was staring him in the face, and denying it would just make things worse. Sergeant Rodriguez pulled up and got out of her car. She was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for being fair, but tough. She took one look at the crowd, the scattered contents of Vincent's car, and the expressions on her officers' faces, and immediately knew this was going to be a problem. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked as she approached. Lisa spoke up before Morrison could say anything. "Sergeant, we pulled over Dr. Hayes for a suspected traffic violation and, well, there have been some complications." "What kind of complications?" Morrison was still holding Vincent's D badge. He looked down at it again, as if hoping it might have changed into something else. But it was still there, still real, still proving that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Morrison," Sergeant Rodriguez said, noticing his strange behavior. "What's in your hand?" Morrison slowly held up the badge. He's a DEA agent." Sergeant Rodriguez took the badge and examined it carefully. Her expression grew more serious as she realized what she was looking at. She looked at Vincent, then at Morrison, then at the crowd of people recording everything. "Dr. Hayes," she sobbed to Vincent. "I apologize for any inconvenience." "Can you tell me what happened here?" Vincent straightened up. "Sergeant, your officers pulled me over claiming I had a broken taillight, which I don't believe is true. Officer Morrison then conducted an unauthorized search of my vehicle based on a claim that he smelled marijuana, which was false. He questioned my right to be in this neighborhood and suggested I was here to sell drugs." Sergeant Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of incident that ended careers and made headlines. Did you identify yourself as a federal agent? I chose not to because citizens shouldn't need special credentials to avoid harassment by police officers. And did you consent to the search? I explicitly stated that I did not consent. I informed Officer Morrison that he lacked probable cause. He proceeded anyway. Morrison was starting to realize the full scope of his situation. Not only had he illegally searched a federal agent's car, but he'd done it in front of a crowd of witnesses who had recorded the entire thing. His career was probably over. Morrison, Sergeant Rodriguez said, her voice deadly serious, return Dr. Hayes's property and get back to your patrol car, now. Morrison began gathering up Vincent's papers and putting them back in his laptop bag. His hands were still shaking and he dropped several items. Lisa helped him collect everything, both of them working in stunned silence. Vincent watched them pack up his belongings. He felt no satisfaction in Morrison's obvious distress. This wasn't about revenge or getting a police officer in trouble. It was about something much bigger than that. Officer Morrison, Vincent said as Morrison handed him his laptop bag. Morrison looked up, expecting anger or threats. Instead, he saw something that surprised him: compassion. This doesn't have to define your career, Vincent said quietly. But it should change how you think about the people you serve. Morrison didn't know what to say. He'd spent 15 years believing he was a good cop, and now he was being shown mercy by the man he'd wronged. The crowd was starting to disperse. Now that the drama seemed to be winding down, but several people were still recording. Vincent knew that by morning, this incident would probably be all over social media and possibly the news. Sergeant Rodriguez handed Vincent his badge back. Dr. Hayes, again, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I can assure you there will be a full investigation, Vincent nodded. I appreciate that, Sergeant. But I hope the investigation leads to training and education, not just punishment. As Vincent got back into his car, Morrison stood by the patrol vehicle, staring at the ground. He was trying to process everything that had just happened. 30 minutes ago, he'd been confident in his abilities as a police officer. Now he wasn't sure of anything. The federal agent he'd accused of being a drug dealer was driving away to grade student papers at a coffee shop, just like he'd said from the beginning. And Morrison was left wondering how he'd gotten everything so completely wrong. Vincent sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. His hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, and he needed a minute to collect himself. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Morrison standing by the patrol car, looking like a man who just watched his entire world collapse. The irony wasn't lost on Vincent. He'd spent years teaching about situations exactly like this one. He'd written papers on racial profiling, conducted training sessions for police departments, and advised federal agencies on best practices for community policing. But experiencing it firsthand was completely different from studying it in an academic setting. As Vincent finally pulled away from the scene, he passed the corner cafe where he'd originally planned to spend his evening. Through the large windows, he could see people sitting at tables with their laptops and books, completely absorbed in their work. It looked so peaceful, so normal. Vincent realized he no longer felt like grading papers tonight. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. This incident would have consequences, not just for Morrison, but potentially for the entire police department. And Vincent knew he'd have some difficult decisions to make about how to handle it. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Sergeant Rodriguez was trying to figure out how to manage what was clearly going to become a major incident. She'd already called her captain to give him a heads up, and she knew that by morning there would be reporters asking questions. Morrison, she said, walking over to where he stood. We need to talk. Morrison looked up at his sergeant with the expression of a man who knew his career was over. I messed up, didn't I? That's putting it mildly. You just illegally searched a federal agent's vehicle based on nothing more than... Rodriguez paused, choosing her words carefully. What was your probable cause again? Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. I thought I smelled marijuana. Did you smell marijuana? The silence stretched between them. Finally, Morrison shook his head. No, I didn't smell anything. Then why did you search his car? Morrison struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make him sound like exactly what he was afraid he might be. He just ... he seemed suspicious. College professor driving to a coffee shop seemed suspicious? He was driving slowly through the neighborhood like he was looking for something. Following GPS directions to his destination, Morrison realized how weak his justifications sounded when spoken out loud. Every reason he'd given for the stop sounded flimsier and more problematic. The more he tried to explain it, Lisa had been listening to this conversation with growing discomfort. She'd gone along with Morrison's decisions because he was her training officer, but now she was wondering if she should have spoken up sooner. Rodriguez, Lisa said, I wanted on record that I questioned the stop multiple times. I didn't think. We had sufficient cause, Sergeant Rodriguez nodded. That's noted, Park, and it's going to be very important when Internal Affairs starts their investigation. The words Internal Affairs hit Morrison like a punch to the gut. He'd never been the subject of an DEA investigation before. His record wasn't perfect. There had been a few citizen complaints over the years, but nothing serious enough to warrant a full investigation. How bad is this going to be? Morrison asked. Rodriguez looked at him seriously. Jake, you illegally detained and searched a DEA agent for 30 minutes, based on no evidence, while a crowd of people recorded the whole thing. How bad do you think it's going to be? Morrison sat down heavily on the hood of his patrol car. 15 years of service, and it might all be over because of one traffic stop. But deep down, he knew this wasn't really about one traffic stop. This was about patterns of behavior, assumptions he'd been making, and biases he'd never fully acknowledged. What happens now? Morrison asked. Now you go back to the station and write a detailed report about everything that happened. Every decision you made, every action you took, every word you said. And then you wait while DEA decides whether you still have a job. The drive back to the police station was silent. Lisa kept glancing at Morrison, wondering what she should say. Part of her felt sorry for him. His career was probably over, and his family would suffer for his mistakes. But another part of her was angry that he'd put her in this position and potentially damaged the reputation of all the good officers she worked with. At the same time, Vincent was pulling into his driveway at home. His wife's car was in the garage, and he could see lights on in the kitchen. He sat in his car for another minute, trying to figure out how to explain to his family what had just happened. When Vincent walked through the front door, his wife Rachel looked up from her laptop at the kitchen table. You're home early. How was the grading session? Vincent set down his briefcase and laptop bag. I never made it to the cafe. What happened? Vincent told her the whole story, from the initial traffic stop to Morrison's discovery of the D badge. Rachel listened with a mixture of anger and concern, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. Are you okay? She asked when he finished. Physically, yes. Emotionally, I'm not sure yet. What are you going to do about it? Vincent had been asking himself the same question during the drive home. I'm not sure. I could file a complaint, sue the department, go to the media. Or I could try to turn this into something positive. What do you mean? This officer made some serious mistakes tonight, but he's not necessarily a bad person. Maybe this could be a teaching moment for him and for the whole department. Rachel studied her husband's face. After 20 years of marriage, she knew how his mind worked. You're thinking about using this in your training programs, aren't you? Vincent nodded. If Morrison is willing to participate, this could become a powerful case study. Real consequences, real learning, real change. And if he's not willing, then I'll pursue other options. But I'd rather try education before punishment. Meanwhile, at the police station, Morrison was struggling to write his incident report. How do you explain 30 minutes of increasingly aggressive behavior toward an innocent person? How do you justify a search that you knew was illegal? How do you admit that your decision-making was influenced by racial bias without using those words? Morrison had started and deleted his report 3 times. Each version sounded worse than the last. The truth was damning, but lying would only make things worse. When the investigation began, Captain Williams knocked on Morrison's office door. He was a veteran officer who'd worked his way up through the ranks and had seen almost everything in his 30-year career. But even he was surprised by tonight's incident. "Morrison, I just got off the phone with the chief. This is going to be a high-profile case. We've already got calls from reporters who saw the videos online." Morrison's heart sank. "It's already online?" "Multiple videos from different angles. The hashtag #DBadge is trending on social media." Morrison put his head in his hands. Not only was his career over, but he'd become a symbol of everything people criticized about modern policing. "Captain, I know I messed up. I know I probably lost my job tonight. But I want you to know that I never intended for things to go that far." Captain Williams sat down across from Morrison. "Jake, intention doesn't matter when the outcome is this bad. But what matters now is how you handle the aftermath. You can fight this, deny everything, and make it worse for everyone. Or you can take responsibility and try to learn from it." Morrison looked up at his captain. "What would you do?" "I'd own my mistakes and try to make sure they never happen again." 3 weeks after the incident, Morrison sat in the waiting room outside the Internal Affairs office, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning. He'd been on administrative leave since that night, spending his days at home while investigators interviewed witnesses and reviewed the evidence. The videos from the traffic stop had gone viral within hours. Morrison's face was now known to millions of people as the cop who illegally searched a DEA agent's car. The comments on social media were brutal, and his family had received threatening phone calls from strangers who'd gotten their number somehow. Morrison's wife had barely spoken to him since the story broke. His teenage son was embarrassed to go to school because his classmates had seen the videos. Morrison felt like his entire life was falling apart, and he wasn't sure how to put it back together. "Officer Morrison?" A woman in a business suit opened the door to the conference room. "We're ready for you." Morrison walked into the room where 3 people sat behind a long table. Detective Chun from Internal Affairs, Captain Williams, and, someone Morrison didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing a professional blazer. "Officer Morrison," Detective Chun began, "this is Dr. Patricia Thompson from the Police Standards and Training Commission. She's here to observe today's proceedings." Morrison nodded and took his seat across from them. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, he just wanted to get it over with. "We've completed our investigation," Detective Chun continued, opening a thick folder. "We've interviewed all witnesses, reviewed the dashcam footage, examined the social media videos, and spoken with Dr. Hayes. Do you want to hear our findings?" Morrison's mouth was dry. "Yes, ma'am. Our investigation found that you conducted an illegal traffic stop without reasonable suspicion, performed an unauthorized search without consent or probable cause, and detained a citizen for 30 minutes based on what appears to be racial profiling." Each word hit Morrison like a physical blow. Hearing it laid out so clinically made his actions sound even worse than they'd felt in the moment. "These are serious violations of department policy and constitutional law," Detective Chun continued. "Normally, violations of this magnitude would result in immediate termination." Morrison felt his heart stop. "Normally?" Captain Williams leaned forward. "Jake, Dr. Hayes has made an unusual request. He's asked that instead of pursuing termination, the department consider an alternative consequence." Morrison looked confused. "What kind of alternative?" Dr. Thompson spoke for the first time. "Dr. Hayes has proposed that you participate in an intensive bias training and community service program. It would involve 200 hours of training on constitutional policing, racial bias, and community relations, plus 300 hours of community service in minority neighborhoods." Morrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man whose rights he'd violated was offering him a second chance instead of demanding his job. "There are conditions," Captain Williams said. "You'd be suspended without pay for 6 months. You'd have to complete the entire program successfully. And you'd be on probation for 2 years after returning to duty. Any future complaints or violations would result in immediate termination." Detective Chun added. Morrison sat in stunned silence. He'd expected to be fired, to lose his pension, to have to start over in a completely different career? Instead, Vincent was giving him an opportunity to learn and grow. Why? Morrison asked. Why would he do that for me? Dr. Thompson smiled slightly. He said that destroying your career wouldn't prevent the next Vincent Hayes from being pulled over illegally, but educating you might. Meanwhile, across town, Vincent was in his office at the university, meeting with his department head about the incident. The university had been fielding calls from reporters for weeks, and they needed to decide how to handle the media attention. Vincent, the university supports you completely, Professor Johnson said. If you want to pursue legal action against the police department, we'll back you up. I appreciate that, Vincent replied, but I think there's a better way to handle this. You mean the training program you proposed? Vincent nodded. I've spent my entire career studying police behavior and community relations. This incident gives us a real-world opportunity to test whether education and training can actually change behavior. And if it doesn't work, if Morrison goes back to his old ways, then at least we'll have data about what doesn't work. But I have to believe that people can change if they're given the right tools and motivation. Professor Johnson studied his colleague's face. This is very generous of you, Vincent. Most people would want justice, not mercy. Justice and mercy aren't mutually exclusive. If Morrison learns from this experience and becomes a better officer, that's justice for every person he encounters in the future. The phone on Vincent's desk rang. It was Sergeant Rodriguez from the police department. Dr. Hayes, I wanted to let you know that Officer Morrison has accepted your proposed alternative consequence. He starts the training program next week. That's good news, Vincent said. I've been working with Dr. Thompson to design a curriculum that focuses on practical applications rather than just theory. There's something else, Rodriguez said. The chief wants to know if you'd be willing to conduct bias training for our entire department. What happened with Morrison has made us realize we need to take a harder look at our practices. Vincent felt a surge of hope. This was exactly the kind of systemic change that could come from one negative incident. I'd be honored to help. After hanging up, Vincent sat back in his chair and thought about the past few weeks. The incident had been traumatic and infuriating, but it was also becoming something positive. Morrison would get a second chance to become a better officer. The police department would receive training that could prevent future incidents, and Vincent would have real-world data for his research. Back at the police station, Morrison was cleaning out his locker. He wouldn't be back for 6 months, and when he returned, everything would be different. He'd be starting over as essentially a rookie officer, having to prove himself all over again. Lisa Park stopped by as he was packing his things. Hey, Morrison, how are you holding up? Morrison looked at his former partner. Honestly, I'm scared. Scared about the training, scared about coming back, scared that I might not be the officer I thought I was. Maybe being scared is good, Lisa said. Maybe it means you're taking this seriously. I keep thinking about that night, Morrison said, about how sure I was that I was right. How could I have been so wrong about everything? I don't know, Lisa said honestly. But I think Dr. Hayes is giving you a chance to figure that out, Morrison nodded. I owe him more than I can ever repay. Then make sure the program works. Become the kind of officer who would never put someone through what you put him through. As Morrison drove home from the station for the last time in 6 months, he thought about Vincent's generosity. The man had every right to be angry, to demand punishment, to make Morrison's life as difficult as possible. Instead, he'd chosen education over retribution. Morrison had no idea if he could successfully complete the training program or if he could become a better officer. But he knew he had to try. Not just for his own career, but for every person he'd encounter if he ever wore the badge again. The next morning, Morrison would start a journey that would either end his career or transform it completely. Either way, he knew he'd never be the same officer who'd pulled over Vincent Hayes that night 3 weeks ago. 6 months later, Morrison stood in front of a mirror in the police station locker room, adjusting his uniform for the first time since the incident. His hands shook slightly as he pinned his badge to his chest. The same badge that had once represented authority and power now felt like a tremendous responsibility. The intensive training program had been the hardest thing Morrison had ever done. Not physically, but emotionally and mentally. For 200 hours, he'd been forced to confront his own biases, examine his assumptions, and face the uncomfortable truths about his behavior that night with Vincent. The community service had been equally challenging. Morrison had spent 300 hours working in neighborhoods he'd previously only driven through as a police officer. He'd helped at community centers, volunteered at food banks, and worked with youth programs. For the first time in his career, he'd seen these communities as places where people lived, worked, and raised families, not just as areas to patrol for crime. Most importantly, he'd listened. He'd heard stories from residents about their experiences with police, their fears, their hopes for their children. He'd learned that being a good police officer meant more than just enforcing laws. It meant serving and protecting all members of the community with dignity and respect. Tonight was Morrison's first shift back on the job. Captain Williams had assigned him to work with Sergeant Rodriguez, who would be evaluating his performance closely. There would be no second chances if he failed to live up to the standards expected of him. "You ready for this?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked as they walked to their patrol car. Morrison took a deep breath. "I think so, I hope so. The community is watching, Morrison. This whole experiment in second chances is being judged by how you perform. Don't mess it up." Morrison nodded. He understood the weight of what he represented. He wasn't just trying to rebuild his own career. He was testing whether the kind of transformation Vincent believed in was actually possible. Meanwhile, across town, Vincent was preparing for his own evening. The university was hosting a community forum on police-community relations, and Vincent had been asked to speak about the training program he'd helped design. The room was packed with residents, police officers, community leaders, and local politicians. 6 months ago, I was illegally stopped and searched by a police officer who made assumptions about who I was based on how I looked, Vincent began his speech. Tonight, I want to talk about what happened next. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I had a choice to make. I could have demanded punishment for the officer who wronged me. I could have filed lawsuits, gone to the media, and tried to destroy his career. And honestly, part of me wanted to do exactly that. Vincent paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. He could see police officers sitting next to community activists, teenagers next to senior citizens, people from all walks of life who cared about making their community better. But I realized that destroying one officer's career wouldn't prevent the next person, who looks like me, from being pulled over for no reason. It wouldn't change the system. It wouldn't make anyone safer or more respected. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, so instead I chose education. I chose to believe that people can change, that bias can be unlearned, that officers can become better at their jobs through training and community engagement. Vincent clicked to the next slide in his presentation, showing statistics from the pilot training program. The results speak for themselves. Officers who completed our bias training program showed measurable improvements in their interactions with community members. Complaints against these officers dropped by 60%. Use of force incidents decreased by 40%. And perhaps most importantly, trust between police and community members began to improve. In the back of the room, Morrison had quietly slipped in to listen to Vincent's speech. He was off duty, but he'd wanted to hear what Vincent had to say about their shared experience. Vincent continued, "Change is possible, but it requires commitment from everyone. Police officers have to be willing to examine their own biases and change their behavior. Community members have to be willing to engage with officers as human beings who can learn and grow. And leadership has to support programs that prioritize education over punishment." After the speech, there was a question and answer session. A young black man in the audience raised his hand. "Dr. Hayes, that's a beautiful story, but how do we know this officer actually changed? How do we know he won't go back to his old ways the first time he's stressed or angry?" It was a fair question, and Vincent had wrestled with it himself many times over the past 6 months. "We don't know for certain," Vincent admitted. "Change is a process, not an event. But what I can tell you is that Officer Morrison completed every hour of training, participated fully in community service and has shown genuine remorse for his actions. The real test will be how he performs on the job going forward. As if on cue, Morrison's radio crackled with a call. A domestic disturbance. In a neighborhood not far from where the forum was being held. Morrison and Sergeant Rodriguez were the closest unit. Unit 247 responding, Rodriguez said into the radio dot as they drove to the scene. Morrison felt his old instincts kicking in. Domestic calls were always unpredictable and potentially dangerous. In the past, he might have approached such a call with aggression and authority, ready to control the situation through force if necessary, but the training had taught him different approaches. He'd learned about de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of listening before acting. They arrived at a small apartment complex where neighbors had reported shouting and breaking glass. A young Hispanic woman was standing outside one of the units, holding a crying baby and looking scared. In the past, Morrison might have assumed she was involved in whatever domestic dispute was happening. He might have questioned her aggressively, demanded to see identification, or treated her as a potential suspect. Instead, he approached her gently. "Ma'am, are you okay? Are you safe?" The woman looked surprised by his tone. "Yes, I'm safe. I just brought my baby outside when the fighting started. I didn't want him to hear it." "That was smart thinking," Morrison said. "Can you tell me what's happening?" As the woman explained the situation, her upstairs neighbors had been arguing loudly and something had crashed. Morrison listened carefully. He asked follow-up questions, showed concern for her and her baby's safety, and treated her as a valuable witness rather than a suspect. When they went to address the actual domestic dispute, Morrison used the de-escalation techniques he'd learned in training. He spoke calmly, listened to both parties, and helped them work through their conflict without anyone being arrested or hurt. 40 minutes later, as they were driving away from the scene, Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Morrison with surprise. "That was well handled," she said. "Good instincts, good communication, good outcome." Morrison felt a surge of pride but also relief. The training had worked. He was thinking differently, reacting differently, and getting better results. Back at the community forum, Vincent was wrapping up his presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, change is hard. It requires courage to admit our mistakes, wisdom to learn from them, and hope to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. 6 months ago, Officer Morrison and I had an encounter that could have ended in bitterness and division. Instead, we chose to turn it into an opportunity for growth and understanding." Vincent looked out at the audience one final time. That choice is available to all of us every day. We can choose punishment or education, division or unity, fear or hope. The future of police-community relations depends on the choices we make. As people filed out of the forum, many stopped to thank Vincent for his presentation and his approach to the situation. Among them was Morrison, who had quietly waited until most of the crowd had left. "Dr. Hayes," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Thank you for believing I could change." Vincent shook Morrison's hand and smiled. "Thank you for proving that belief was justified." 6 months later, Morrison had become an advocate for the bias training program within the police department. He regularly spoke to new recruits about his experience and the importance of treating every citizen with dignity and respect. The incident that nearly ended his career had become the foundation for a better version of himself, and Vincent continued his work, using real-world experiences to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. One conversation and one changed mind at a time.